Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Okay, great.
Let's make sure. Okay, the floor is all yours. You can go ahead and start.
Okay, so I really loved a lot of these talks today, and I'm going to be coming at this from an entirely different perspective than a lot of the talks that are going on. I'm a personality social psychologist by training, which means that I look at the psychology of the cyber attacker and the cyber attacked, so to speak, rather than any kind of technical processes that go on. But we just heard a fantastic talk about skill and ability and the ability to triangulate this information to reveal the identity of somebody. I think that complements nicely and segues nicely into what I'm going to be talking about, which has to do with personality and what types of individuals are going to be doing this type of cyber attack. And quite frankly, how are they going to go about doing it? So I want to start with a joke to lighten the mood a little bit. A Machiavellian, a psychopath, and a narcissist get stranded in a desert for 3 days, okay? Finally, they come to a clearing, and there's a vendor selling drinks, okay? But the vendor says, why should I give you a drink? You don't have any money. And the psychopath steps up and says, give me a drink or I'm going to punch you in the face, right? Narcissist shoves him aside and says, no, give me a drink. I'm way more important than these other two guys. And the Machiavellian pulls out a hidden canteen and says, you got a beer? I've been drinking nothing but water for 3 damn days. So the idea that the Machiavellian, in this scenario, while I think hilariously funny, because I came up with the joke myself, actually applies to how I see these 3 traits, which have been termed the dark triad of personality. The way they go about manipulating the world and getting what they want is very different. Narcissism through self-promotion, psychopathy through aggression, and Machiavellian through stealth. Okay. Uh-oh, did I lose my... Uh-oh, I froze. That's not good. Okay, so let me walk you through the outline of my talk. First, I'm going to introduce you to concepts such as the dark triad and mimicry deception theory. These are 2 concepts I've been working with in cyberspace, cyber attacks, and cyber defense, which tell us a little bit about how people are going to approach the attack. From there, I'll apply those concepts to things like system infiltration, right? When somebody does approach a system or simply hacking a network, there are different ways you can go about doing it. There's not just one way to skin the cat when it comes to approaching a system. So who's going to take the more fast-paced direct route and who's going to be more stealthy? Okay, we'll talk about that. And then I'm going to switch gears to socially engineered attacks and talk a little bit about phishing, both attack and vulnerability. So who is targeted by whom and the different approaches and vulnerabilities that these traits have. And then finally, I'll talk about some resource control games that we've done, looking at modified forms of the flip it game, and end with some solutions and future directions. So let's dive in. The first thing I always remind people of in most of my talks is Kurt Levine's model of field theory, which is all behavior is a system of the personality, the environment, and the personality by environment interaction. Okay, so when I talk about these personality traits, this is not a be-all, end-all. There is absolutely additional variance that can be predicted by the situation they're in, the system they're attacking, the individual they're manipulating. So this is very much the personality side that I talk about, but I don't want anybody to forget that or think I've forgotten that the situation matters tremendously. And as we just heard in the previous talk, skill is going to interact with these characteristics quite a lot to predict how effective a particular attack could be. So if an attacker, for example, is very stealthy but lacks complete skill, they're going to be detected either way and not be very successful. Whereas if an individual has a lot of skill and is very stealthy, that interaction is probably going to predict success above and beyond the individual components. So I study 3 particular personality traits, which is referred to in the literature as the dark triad, which is Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and narcissism. If you add subclinical sadism to the mix, then you get a dark tetrad. These traits, while they overlap, there are unique pieces to them that contribute to the particular type of harm that they do. Machiavellianism is associated with kind of a cynical attitude. The world is a horrible place. People are out to get each other and protect themselves. So don't whine that I manipulated you. You would have done it to me. I just got you first. They're very flexible and strategic in how they approach their manipulation. So they're not very brute force. They think things through. They'll jump on an opportunity if it's there, but they'll think twice about when the right time to act is. In contrast, although they're all callous and manipulative, narcissism has this grandiose, I'm the best, I'm deserving attitude. And they tend to be quite overconfident in how they approach a system and how they attack and manipulate other people. So they use charm, and they're shocked to find out people don't like them, which is, I usually say in my talks, if you've dated more than 3 people, one of them was probably a narcissist, because they're incredibly charming, and it's almost like a requisite rite of passage. But their overconfidence gets them into trouble because it makes them take cocksure risks and engage in impulsive behaviors through overconfidence. And then psychopathy, which is the one that people think they should be worried about, are reckless, prone to antisocial criminal behavior, and impulsive. And these are the folks that don't weigh the pros and cons of their actions. They just act. They see an opportunity. They see a wallet. They take it, even though it could have been their boss's wallet, and they'll end up getting fired and going to jail. Right? That's a type of impulsive, reckless, tactical approach that a psychopath takes. So as you can see, these traits, although they share this common element of darkness, willingness to harm and exploit, they all go about it in different ways. And then if you talk about sadism, which we haven't done a lot yet on, but they just want to see people get riled up and cause chaos, right? Kind of like the Joker from the Dark Knight, right? They just want to see the world burn. Okay, so we talk about their motivations. They're all in it for profit, but the psychopaths and the narcissist, or the psychopaths and the sadists, are really kind of across the spectrum, interested in all sorts of kind of rewards and outcomes. Machiavellians and narcissists are really the ones that are, especially Machiavellians, are the ones that are driven by profit and money. So you're not going to see a whole lot of Machiavellianism in attacks that are risky, or in attacks that are not worth it, right? It's got to be worth their time. And so if we start talking about what criminal behaviors they engage in, individuals high in all of them are willing to do cybercrime, but Machiavellians, you're not going to find them doing the violent, drug-related stuff. We have data from Iranian prisoners demonstrating that the Machiavellians that are in jail are usually in jail for fraud or political-related crimes rather than drug-related or violent crimes. But individuals high in psychopathy, they don't discriminate. If it is something that they want, they'll take it, irrespective of the consequences, which both psychopaths and sadists lead them prone to all kinds of misbehavior. Okay, so this is kind of what we figured out is the process behind their actions. Machiavellians, they don't weigh the morals of their actions. None of them do. There's no real morality behind it. It's Machiavellians, they weigh the pros and cons. If it's in favor of action, they'll take action. If it's not in favor of action, they won't take action. Their moral compass is completely ignored in this process. Narcissistic individuals, if they feel it's justified with their ego and it's beneficial, they'll do it. Psychopaths and sadists merely act. Okay. Now, the dark triad, while it's enjoyed a tremendous amount of popularity, is a personality model, and it's not readily usable for profiling online behaviors. I've talked to a lot of hackers, and most of them don't want to give me their personality. So we've developed a behavioral model that looks at deception. Because if you think of it this way, there's no crime that a Machiavellian would commit that a narcissist or psychopath or sadist would think better of. Right? So it's not, oh, I would never do that. No, they're all willing to engage in any crime. Morality is not a barrier. It's just that there are things that psychopaths and sadists would do that Machiavellians and narcissists would not do. So it's the when and the why that make a huge difference. And when we apply this to cyberspace, we can see that individuals high in Machiavellianism are going to do and they're prone to cybercrime for the very reason that it's a safer type of more stealthy crime than pulling a knife on somebody. That's a high risk crime, okay? Okay, so deception is characteristic of all four traits. Machiavellians use strategic manipulation, narcissists use self-deception, and psychopaths and sadists use aggressive and consistent lying and deception. Okay, but what does it mean to use strategic manipulation? Okay, what do I mean by that? Okay, and up until recently, the field has lacked a coherent model, the field of psychology, that is, has lacked a coherent model of what it means to be long versus short-term oriented. Okay, so a little while ago, I developed what's called the mimicry deception theory. And this was based on my biology background. And, you know, viruses, as the analogy goes, in both in computer science and virology, fit general patterns of analogy, right? They're analogous to each other. And so is deception. Okay, so as it turns out, all organisms, from viruses up to humans, have evolved the deception. Okay, this deception clusters in ways that parallel human deception. Okay, so for example, this is an Australius nigrum, which is an Australian jumping spider. It uses behavioral, chemical, and physical mimicry to infiltrate colonies of ants. And when the ants are sleeping, this spider will eat them. And however, if this spider gets into some trouble, the other ants will come to its defense. So they treat this spider as one of them. And I argue that's a parallel for long-term deception. Okay, you have the HIV virus, right? Which is it mimics the host system, convinces the immune system not to worry, integrates itself into that biological ecosystem, and deceives and exploits slowly. Okay, even plants deceive using fungus superhighways. Okay, and you have animals and humans. Okay, now what I argue is the key difference is that in long-term cases of deception, you have complexity, you have forethought, you have planning that goes into the deception prior to deployment. Okay, you also have slow and sustainable resource extraction. So in the case of HIV or the Australian nigrum, you have they don't eat all the ants at once. They don't gorge themselves. They don't reveal their hand. They extract the resources they're after slowly enough that it's never noticed until, you know, perhaps it's too late. They integrate themselves heavily into a system or a community. So they stay and maintain presence in these communities rather than spanning here today, gone tomorrow, like a fraudster would, or like coronavirus or influenza, where you can sneeze on somebody and it spans communities, but it doesn't integrate quite deeply into the system. And then it tends to, long-term deception tends to remain undetectable, okay? Now, hopefully, as I go through this, this is starting to trigger things like, oh my God, all right, complex mimicry, like, you know, how you program, what modules you use to hack a system, you know, how much time and forethought, how much reconnaissance you've done, you know, available for the target that you're going to deceive, you know, how slow I'm going to hack the system and how integrated into the system I'm going to get, how much I want to remain, keep persistence and presence in the system, and how undetectable I'm going to try to be. There are some, you guys know this better than I do, that there are some attacks that simply you're in, you're out, and you take everything you can at once and you're gone and you erase your presence. Where in other cases, you may stay for months in a system, slowly, quietly cultivating information, okay? So the flip side of this in the short term is you use superficial or visual confusion. You use immediate or maximum resource extraction. There's no community integration. You span communities. You're here today, you're gone tomorrow. And you don't care that you're detectable because by the time you're found out, it's way too late. Okay, so this is a paper we just published recently in Computers and Human Behavior on system infiltration. So I presented participants with a scenario, a game I call Mafia Raid, where I tell them, and I chose the Mafia because if you say, you know, you're going to hack Grandma Tea Kettle's 401k, they're going to be like, no, I don't want to do that. And you get like, you know, only maybe 15–20% of the population willing to hack Grandma Tea Kettle's 401k. So you say, okay, you're hired by the FBI to attack the Mafia. And we want to see how you would go about doing that. Okay, so in this study, you'll be telling us how you would hack a database of a notorious mafia group. Your job is to tell us how you would overtake the computer system through a series of hacking steps. Now, we did this on a crowdsourcing website, assuming people knew absolutely nothing about how to hack a system, okay? So we walked them very gently through the steps. So we argued that there are 7 key steps that you can take to enter a system. And at any time, they could do it slowly, quickly, moderately, or skip it. Okay, so passive recon, active recon, exploitation, privilege escalation, and so on. Okay, so this is what they saw when they went through the actual paradigm, right? So they would see passive reconnaissance, and we'd explain what that means. This is the only step that is not illegal in the real world. You know, you're looking for any information that could be leveraged to use against your target. And then we'd ask them, what would you do? Would you skip this step, spend a little time, moderate amount of time, or spend a lot of time on this? Okay. And here's what we found. We found that Machiavellianism was really strongly correlated with the planful stages of hacking. So passive recon, active recon, privilege escalation, and so on. Okay. And in particular, you can see a negative link between narcissism in these steps. You can see mostly negative links between psychopathy in these steps and mimicry deception theory, which is a scale I developed to measure that long-term and short-term propensity for deception. Also, like Machiavellianism, correlates strongly with long-term stealthy approaches, slow, stealthy approaches to attacking a system. Now, a very fair criticism of this is, well, first of all, these people don't know jack about what they're doing. And more importantly, this is hypothetical. So, and we have begun studies now where there's an actual cost to participants, a physical cost time-wise to take a long-term approach. But in the meantime, what we did was a hackathon. And so we had computer science and engineering students get together, and 75% men, as the nature of the CS field. So it was advertised as an exercise in cybersecurity, and we invited anybody who was familiar with network intrusion detection systems and scanning to go ahead and sign up for a monetary, not only just credit for course, but a monetary reward for winning the game. Okay, so initial training was provided and activities to the students who needed to perform this study. So they were white hat or pen testers. And they were told to gather as much information as possible, scoring as much as possible as attackers against the emulated networks. Okay, so they were given 5 video tutorials of technical information for successfully completing the experiment. And there were 5 scanning scenarios they were exposed to. Now, this is where I start getting into not knowing some of this technical language, but we did find that some of the stealthy markers that we had, like pinging networks and making sure being careful about what you did, not being detected, correlated pretty strongly or moderately with both Machiavellianism and mimicry deception theory. And again, we get very little effect, not negative, but trivial effects of psychopathy and narcissism. And if you take a look at the regression correlations, you see Machiavellianism really is very strong in predicting these stealthy moves. Okay, so that demonstrates to a certain degree that these characters are approaching these systems differently. And if we can understand a little bit about their psychology, about how they're approaching a system, we can tell a whole lot more about the character. So if somebody's approaching a stealthy system, they're likely to be higher in Machiavellianism than they are in psychopathy, and that tells us a little bit more about the attacker. But socially engineered attacks are something that I'm particularly interested in, and this was a paper we published in Computers and Human Behavior in 2018. This was done with Cleotide Gonzalez and Dr. Rajavan, who were at Carnegie Mellon. They collected an attacker sample, 100 people, who composed 5 emails each. We collected their dark triad scores as well. Attackers were instructed to write phishing emails, okay, to evade a spam filter and persuade the end user, okay? And then we sent these emails that were composed out to a fresh sample of participants, and we collected their dark triad scores, as well as several other key personality characteristics. And then we asked them to respond to these emails based on whether they would open it immediately, leave the email in the inbox, and flag it for follow-up, leave the email in the inbox, delete it, or delete and block the sender, creating a Likert type scale of caution, okay? And what we found was that the dark triad traits, which made sense, were not any different in persuasiveness than any of the other ones. So again, going back to the previous talk, how much skill do you have in composing these emails is going to matter more than how you go about composing the emails. However, the attack patterns were significantly different, and this is what's interesting. So we found that psychopathy and narcissism both made fewer edits. They made the bare minimum of edits to evade the spam filter, but kept spamming similar emails. Machiavellianism was associated with making significantly more edits and making changes and trying to compose more of a brand new email to try again, okay? And the same was true of the subject line edits, okay? Machiavellianism didn't make many changes to subject line edits, whereas psychopathy made fewer, and so did narcissism. Okay, so what was really interesting in this study, however, and this leads into several new lines of research that we're working on right now, is narcissistic individuals were most vulnerable to the phishing attacks. They fell for it, presumably because of their arrogance. I would know a phishing email if I saw one, and that's not a phishing email. And, well, yeah, it is. But what was most interesting was that while the D3 were not, dark triad were not more persuasive, narcissistic attackers were most persuasive to narcissistic end users. So there was a cross-level interaction there between when a narcissistic composer of the phishing email that email was read by a narcissistic end user, there was significantly more successful phishing that went on. Okay, so speaking of phishing, we talk about targets of phishing. And so who do these characters look for? So we provided participants with a scenario that said, if you were a hacker, or a cyber attacker, or whatever, how likely would you be to attack each of these following targets? And we did several factor analyses to determine the order of these folks, but ultimately what it came down to was money. Okay, so we had Bill, age 66, worth 750 grand, and so on. Okay. What we found was that Machiavellian individuals were significantly more likely to attack rich targets regardless of their age. And psychopathic individuals were significantly more likely to attack the poor targets irrespective of age. So when you talk about, again, making it worth my while, if you are a big fish, people who go whaling, who go after CEOs and top executives of companies are likely to be intelligent Machiavellians. They're likely to be skilled Machiavellians. They're not going to be psychopathic individuals just simply because they don't have the patience to go through the process that it would take to compose a spearfished whale type email to those folks and get it through with any kind of stealth, okay? Whereas the person who's going to be attacking the 401k of some poor retired worker is more likely to be a psychopath. Okay, how am I doing on time? I got like 3 minutes because I want to leave time for questions. So let's talk about resource control. So we modified for our, I did this study with Chris Kiekenfeld at University of Texas, El Paso. We had an Army Research Lab grant to do this. We looked at a modified Flip It game, okay? For those who aren't aware, Flip It is simply a resource control game where when a resource is in your possession, you accumulate points. However, at any time without you knowing, your adversary could flip it over into their control. And then you start, the adversary starts gaining points when it's in their control. To flip costs resources, okay? But leaving a resource in an adversary's control is even more costly. So you don't want to constantly be flipping because that's going to, when it's already in your possession, because that's going to be costly, but you want to flip if the resource may potentially be in an adversary's position or possession. So we had dark triad individuals, we collected dark triad measures, and we had them play attacker in a resource control game. And we modified the game such that there were 5 nodes rather than 1 with varying costs and reward associated to it. So participants would select one of the nodes. The game would proceed to the next. So this is a partially stochastic game. We use game theoretic algorithms to solve this game. So participants were randomly assigned to play against a random attacker or random adversary or a game theoretic adversary. We told them that ahead of time. And then participants played 6 rounds of this game where they would flip a resource initially, and then they could choose to flip that same resource back. And again, they don't know what the attacker was doing. Okay, and what we found was that overall, with respect to the total points, individuals high in psychopathy and narcissism performed significantly worse at this game. And in particular, individuals high in Machiavellianism performed significantly better in a multi-level model. So once again, we see the stealthy nature of a Machiavellian coming through in these particular situations, okay? And we found that individuals high in psychopathy were significantly more likely in the strategic condition when they're playing against a game theoretic algorithm to attack high cost nodes. And this fits with the psychopathy literature showing that individuals high in psychopathy are not really sensitive to punishment. So the threat of being punished doesn't affect them. And so, you know, through my time working with Army Research Lab and working with Chris Kiekenfeld, one of the things that we're starting to realize is that these game theoretic algorithms or sophisticated defense honey nets and honeypots may not necessarily be outsmarted by a psychopath, but they're based on a system of rational decisions. And psychopaths are impervious to punishment. So when you have a psychopath that's attacked the system, they're not necessarily going to do what's rational. And so, you know, these game theoretic algorithms are predicting a rational actor, but you're dealing with a very irrational enemy. Okay, so future directions. One of the things that we're really trying to do is mix sadism into this now. So there was a case about 4 years ago, somebody set off the tornado sirens in Dallas, thought it was hysterical. What's the point of hacking a tornado system? JK lulz, right? Just for fun. So we're starting to see more of this now coming up where if it's online, people hack it. Why? Either out of narcissistic challenge or out of sadistic pleasure, okay? One of the things that we're trying to work on in particular, because again, nobody's going to give me their personality when they're attacking a system. Oh, could you please, while you're hacking my bank account, could you please fill out this questionnaire for me? That usually doesn't happen, okay? What we're looking for is inflection points now. So at what point going through a network can somebody exploit everything and get out, or continue to gather information and go for a much bigger gain? At what point do these decision trees reveal the hand of the personality of the person behind the keyboard? So this is, we've made some headway on that, looking at decision trees and branches and getting within a certain percentile reliability of the character behind the keyboard. And then looking at solutions, right? Use defensive deception. I think against a skilled Machiavellian, you can use a honeypot system, or you can use honey users and things like that. With psychopathy, they're going for the gold. They're going to do what is somewhat unpredictable and irrational. So you may be better off taking the system down. Okay. And I want to give a shout out to my friend and collaborator, Rakesh. We just got an NSF, and we're going to be studying, looking at overconfidence in end users. We're going to be building on that narcissism finding. In particular, we're going to be building, looking at protecting end users in social engineered attacks using an old communications theory called inoculation, right? So inoculation theory basically is that you give somebody a weakened, small version of an attack and a threat. They build up their own psychological counter arguments to that persuasion attack. And when they see it in real life, weeks later, they are resilient to the actual attack. So I'm very excited to be working with him on this. It's a big honor. And I just want to acknowledge my co-Is for my ARL grant, which is what that funding facilitated most of the work that I've done up to this point, and that's Christopher Kiekenfeld and Bronislav Bozansky. And we were funded by the Army Research Laboratory under the CRA, the Collaborative Resource Agreement. And I want to thank my two students, Jessica Correa, she's at Army Research Institute, and Shelby Curtis, who's at Louisiana Tech, and all my collaborators. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Very interesting talk. So there are some questions here. Let's start with you, Shruti.
Yeah, actually, it's very interesting talk, and I'm wondering if the method you use to access the dark triad score is publicly available, like for us to take.
Oh yeah, absolutely. my website is darktriad.co, and we have all kinds of assessments that we put up there. You can download the questionnaires, and they're all in the public domain, free to use.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Thanks. And also I'm wondering, so you mentioned some study tested the prisoners to test their like association with their dark triad and some other traits. So do they also let the prisoners take this questionnaire, or they have some other method to access their scores?
That data set I lucked into through a dear friend of mine who lived in Iran and worked in a Tehran central prison and was able to schmooze his way into getting access to these offenders and handing out a whole bunch of my questionnaires and stuff. That was a once in a lifetime data set. Getting access to prisoners is incredibly tricky. My dream in cybersecurity is to get access to some, cyber criminals and interview them, but the FBI and I need a lot more collaboration to do that. So,
Okay. Thank you.
Dan, I have a question. So I was wondering if you looked at any relationships with the demographic effects in your study of vulnerability to phishing attacks.
Yes, we did. Gender didn't emerge as a vulnerability, but there are differences in some of these games, like the resource control game, that did emerge. So we did a honeypot game, and we found that Machiavellian men are much more vulnerable to some defenses than Machiavellian women, and we don't know why. That's purely exploratory. We didn't find anything with the phishing, but that is a really interesting new future line of research, because we have shown in previous research that Machiavellian men are a bit more strategic than Machiavellian women, and again, we don't know really why. But because this is still a very male-dominated field of cybersecurity, it's getting different. But that demographic and being a minority with a dark personality may change the fundamental dynamics of your attack strategy. So yeah, we haven't seen any so far in the social engineering attacks, but we have seen some in the resource control paradigms, and we need to follow up on that.
All right. Any other questions?
I think Omid has his hand up.
Oh, okay. Yeah, go ahead, Omid.
Hi. Yes, fascinating. Thank you. The psychopaths, are there a standard definition? So I'm just recalling from a book I read, The Wisdom of Psychopath. And from what I remember, maybe I'm wrong, but it sounded like more Machiavellian in your treatment. Is that so psychopaths are, calculating, or what, they don't have empathy? These are things that I kind of remember there. Are there, yeah, that was basically.
Yeah, so there's a lot of controversy. I'm fighting several battles with people who still say psychopathy is just everything bad. And when we talk about psychopaths, they could be impulsive, or they could be strategic, or they could be, then it becomes a useless construct, because then it predicts all things bad, and then we lose predictive power. So my argument with Machiavellianism is that you either have impulse control or you don't. And if you don't, you fit this more psychopathic profile. If you do, then you fit more of this Machiavellian profile.
I see. Yes.
Now, you can say, oh, this is what we call a successful psychopath, or a non-impulsive. Well, now we're into games of semantics. Whether you call it a Machiavellian or successful psychopath, I don't care. But the key is that there are profound differences in attack patterns with these malicious characters, depending on whether they have impulse control or not.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
I had another question. So if I were to analyze my attackers, and if I, for example, determine that Machiavellianism is a bigger threat to me than sadism or psychopathy for my systems, how would I go about improving my defenses in that case? Having this, having acquired this knowledge, how could my defenses be specifically improved? So that was the question.
Well, that's where, and again, this is super preliminary, but we did a honeypot paradigm with the dark triad, and we found that multi-armed bandit and learning algorithms do really well against Machiavellians.
Okay.
So defensive deception, I think, is the future against these stealthy attackers. Where it seems that it doesn't really capture the psychopath, because as you're dancing around trying to create honey this and honey that, they're in and out.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you. Will this presentation or like research be available online?
I did a recording back in March, so. I think-
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Really interesting work.
Thank you. Thank you.
I would like to first thank you for your presentation. It was really insightful. I wanted to go back to a little point, the last point you mentioned, and I want a little bit more clarification on like examples for inoculation exactly. Can you maybe give me a little bit more insight on that?
Absolutely. So what we proposed was, so persuasion, phishing can be considered persuasion, but you would generally agree, I would think, right, that phishing is a persuasion attempt. And persuasion, according to Robert Cialdini, who's like god of persuasion research back at Arizona State, argues that there are 7 basic principles, 6 or 7 basic principles of persuasion, right? So there's scarcity, and there's social proof, and there's been several articles written on phishing, categorizing phishing emails in this way. And what we did was we took those categories and we created an inoculation. And the inoculation read something like, you know, phishers are going to tell you that you are in trouble and you have to pay a fine, and if you do it now, you know, it'll be waived, but you know, there's a warrant out for your arrest. They're going to pray. And so what we did was we alerted them to the threat, and then we alerted them to what the phisher is going to try to make you feel, and what they're going to try to make you think. That this is going to make you panic, and you are going to think this. However, remember that if the FBI really had a warrant out for your arrest, they'd probably contact you over the phone, or there would be an officer show up at your door. So this is what they're going to try to do. So we basically try to take the bunny rabbit out of the magician's hat and say, this is what they're going to do, right, in the inoculation treatment. And it's a 2-step process. So you first say, like, you know, this is a threatening thing. This, you could lose your livelihood. You could lose a lot. And here's how they're going to do it. This is what they're going to try to make you think. This is what they're going to try to make you feel. And the process is supposed to be internal, where they start saying, yeah, no, I would say, if I was given that, then I would say, no, they'll come to my, and those natural psychological antibodies build up. And then when they get hit with the actual phishing attack, they resist. Does that help? And if you email me, I could send you the manipulations we're using.
Okay, perfect. I will definitely do that. Thank you so much for your clarification.
Yeah, no problem.
So if we have no more questions, we can go on and thank Professor Daniel Jonas for his talk today. And we can go ahead to the break as well.